remember the Alamo? People used to. In fact, they used to admire the courage of the defenders in that battle over Texan independence that began on February 23rd of 1836. It used to be a heroic and inspiring story. Somehow now it seems to become embarrassing. In case the facts have faded from memory, a far larger Mexican force besieged about 300 advocates of Texan independence. And after 13 days, they stormed the fort and they killed all the survivors. This act of brutality backfired. It inspired outrage. A whole bunch more people flooded to the Texian cause, and fairly soon they won a decisive victory and secured independence for Texas. Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett really did die at the Alamo. It used to be the stuff of legend. So what went wrong? Well, the feeling that people have nowadays is somehow that this is part of an imperialist venture, that the United States stole that land from Mexico. Certainly that was a prevalent feeling in Mexico, to the point that the Germans tried to use it during the First World War to lure Mexico into an attack on the United States. At least the Mexican government had more sense than to do that. But is this really a fair reading of what happened with Texas achieving independence in 1836, and then after the War of 1848 being annexed to the United States? It hinges on the claim that although Texans did not want to be part of Mexico, they had no right to self-determination. Anybody who knows much about the history of Mexico knows that its government's been pretty rotten almost from the beginning. And therefore anybody who said in 1836, you know what, I'd rather not live under the government of Mexico, actually, seems to me, had a good point. And the conduct of the Mexican army, both its incompetence and its brutality in the campaign, rather confirmed that. But people say, hang on a second, these Texans weren't real Mexicans. They were white people who moved in after 1821 in large numbers. And as a matter of fact, that's true. On the other hand, they were invited in by the Mexican government. And as I say, if they subsequently became unhappy with the Mexican government, well, a lot of people in Mexico were unhappy with their government. They just weren't very lucky in getting rid of it, or if they did get rid of it, in replacing it with something better. And there's another thing here. If you say that for some reason, even though these people were there legitimately and they exercised their right of self-government, they shouldn't have been able to take the land from Mexico because it belonged to the Mexicans, well, then you run into the problem that the people in Mexico, largely descended from Spanish colonists, had displaced the Aboriginals. So if you want to give the Alamo and Texas back to Mexico, then surely you have to give Mexico back to the Aboriginal inhabitants. Which leads you to the difficulty that the Spanish took a great deal of it from the Aztecs, who themselves were brutal, bloodthirsty conquerors and cannibals who practiced ritual human sacrifice. So you can't give it back to the Aztecs, you have to give it back to the people they displaced. And this goes on in a cascading pattern until recorded history runs out, and there's no way to get anywhere close to perfect justice. So instead you come back to this idea, do people have an inherent right to self-government and to the protection of their life, liberty, and property? If they do, then the Texans were absolutely right to exercise their desire to be governed better than they were, except, and I have to underline this, in one critical respect. The Texans wanted to have racial slavery, which was illegal in Mexico, though the newer immigrants to Texas largely ignored that, and after Texas seceded, of course, it did have slavery and became part of the Confederacy. So there was a terrible denial of human rights there that was eventually set right far too late in a far from satisfactory way. But the fact remains that the defense of the Alamo was courageous, it was principled, and it was in defense of people's right to be properly governed, which they weren't being by the Mexican government. So yes, we should remember the Alamo. We should remember the complexity, we should remember the downside, but we should also remember the heroism, because it really was a noble stand against an unjust government, and that's always a good thing. If you're enjoying these podcasts, please visit my website. That's www.johnrobson.ca. Make a monthly pledge to help support my work. And also, subscribe to The Rebel, keep watching, and keep supporting it.